It is a ship that supposedly doesn't exist, one of the many in the Russian shadow fleet that has been keeping Putin's war alive by transporting illicit oil all over the world. But it was caught. The shadow ship was very much real, and the UK found it. And once the ship was spotted, it was all over. The UK went full James Bond mode as it sent Royal Marines to not only intercept Russia's shady ship, but to board it and expose what Putin is trying to do to keep his war going. The news broke on June 14th. Royal Marine commandos have boarded a Russian shadow fleet tanker somewhere in the English Channel during the early hours of the day. Those Marines were joined by officers who were part of the UK's National Crime Agency, or NCA, and they received support from the Royal Air Force to complete a 6-hour operation that the BBC says was the first of its kind conducted by the UK against the Russian shadow fleet. There are reasons why it took so long for the UK to start taking this kind of action, as legal barriers needed to be overcome, but right now the focus will stay on Russia's ship. It's called the Smyrtos, and it's one of the massive fleet of ancient oil tankers that Putin has been using to transport Russia's oil and gas around the world, as he desperately attempts to escape from the closing net of sanctions. Al Jazeera tells us a little more about the vessel. It says that the Smyrtos was sailing under the Cameroonian flag, which is a pretty typical tactic employed by the shadow fleet. Sailing under Russia's flag makes a ship a clear target. Russia instead falsely uses the flags of other nations in the hope that its shady vessels will be able to bypass monitoring and get to where they need to go. In the case of the Smyrtos, where it needed to go appeared to be Port Said in Egypt. The ship had set sail from Russia's Baltic port of Ust-Luga on June 5th, reportedly carrying around 700,000 barrels of oil. That's a lot of liquid gold wrapped up in metal right there. Back in May, research fellow at the London School of Economics Luke Cooper said that Russia was getting about $59 per barrel after Operation Epic Fury in Iran led to the prices rising from $40 per barrel once the Strait of Hormuz was blockaded. Using that figure, we can estimate that the Smyrtos was carrying a little over $41 million of oil, which is all revenue that was supposed to be brought back to Russia so that the Kremlin could tax it and use its share to fund the Ukraine war. That oil isn't going anywhere anymore, and neither is the money that Russia expected to get for it. The ownership structure of the Smyrtos sheds a little more light on its role in the shadow fleet. Al Jazeera says that the ship is registered under a Hong Kong-based company named Zhaoyao Shipping Limited, which the outlet claims owns several other shadow fleet ships that have been sanctioned by Western powers. That company is overseen by a management company based in the Tamil Nadu state of India, which shows us that Russia tries to set up multiple layers of ownership to hide the fact the shadow fleet ships it's sailing are owned by Russia. None of this sneakiness counted for much on June 14th. The UK's Royal Marine Commandos showed Russia that none of its tactics work when one of its shady ships sails into the English Channel. What little we know about the operation comes from media reports and a video published by the UK that sends a clear message to Putin that the crews on his shadow fleet ships can't do anything to stop a military that is willing to board. Al Jazeera reports that the UK's Ministry of Defence says that the raid took place during the pre-dawn hours of June 14th, and that it involved Royal Marine commandos descending directly onto the Smyrtos using ropes dropped from Chinook helicopters. Other unnamed military aircraft were present to serve as support, as was a Royal Navy frigate and a mine-hunting vessel, the latter presumably sent just in case any warships accompanying Russia's shady ship decided to lay mines around it once they realized the inevitability of its capture. Videos published by the Ministry of Defence back up Al Jazeera's claims. In one 44-second clip, we see Marines descending onto the Russian ship via helicopter, followed by commandos conducting a step-by-step sweep of the vessel. Cabins are raised, documents are found, and it's clear from the footage that the Marines didn't face much resistance from the Smyrtos' crew. That's to be expected. The ship is an oil tanker, not a warship. However, there's always the possibility that Russia will station soldiers on its shadow fleet tankers, and the Royal Marines had to be prepared for the possibility of a firefight breaking out. Thankfully, nothing like that happened. By the end of the operation, the UK reported that NCA officers had taken an Indian national into custody on suspicion of sanction-related offences. The rest of the 24-strong crew appears to have been from Georgia and India, with all remaining on board while they are assisting with the investigation, as the UK puts it. That's a nice way of saying they're leaving brown stains in their pants while Marines and NCA officers question them about just why they are working on a Russian shadow fleet ship. The UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer was quick to point out the bravery shown in the operation, as well as why it's so important that the UK is now raiding Shadow Fleet ships. This successful operation delivers yet another blow to Russia and reminds those fueling Putin's war in Ukraine that we will not let them hide, Starmer declared. The raid couldn't have come at a better time for Starmer, as he reels from the revelation that his Defence Secretary John Healey has resigned over what he believes is the UK spending too little on its national defence. As for Russia's response, there hasn't been one. Russia doesn't want to admit that the UK just humiliated it for the world to see, and it certainly doesn't want to draw any more attention to a Shadow Fleet vessel that isn't even supposed to exist. So Putin has to watch as the UK parades its capture around, seething as he sees the videos and realises that the UK is no longer playing around when it comes to the Shadow Fleet. Sanctions weren't working well enough. Now, Royal Marines are doing what those sanctions have failed to do. Though there was no response from the Kremlin, there was a response of sorts that Russia mustered up in the immediate aftermath of the UK's raid. No words were spoken, no orders given that anybody outside of Russia would have heard. But something started happening in the English Channel that told the UK that Putin had received the message that it sent on June 14th, loud and clear. Shadow Fleet ships scattered and sailed away from the Channel as fast as their engines could take them. In its own June 14th report, where it covers the Marines' raid, the paper revealed that 6 Shadow Fleet tankers had sailed right back out of the English Channel following the capture of the Smyrtos, and those ships weren't in the mood to hang around. U-turn after U-turn was recorded, with the end result being that 6 of Russia's Shadow Fleet took just 77 minutes to get out of the waterway that the UK has just turned into an extremely risky route. Of the 6 ships, 3 turned back in the vague direction of Russia and Scandinavia, implying that they were vessels that had been filled up with oil at Russia's Baltic ports and were now running back home before the UK's Marines could find and capture them too. The other 3 vessels chose a different course, turning away from the English Channel to head toward Ireland, perhaps believing that the UK wouldn't have the time or resources to stop them as they attempted to circumvent the English Channel. If you're looking for Russia's response to the raid on the Smyrtos, then these ships just delivered it. Run as far away from the UK as possible. The paper reveals that we know a little more about these 6 scurrying ships. 2 of them, the Maini and the Khazar, were sailing from Russia to ports in Egypt, just like the Smyrtos. Another, named the Sona, was sailing out of Sudan, was also heading in Egypt's direction. The Pate claims to be heading to the Indian port of Chennai, though it's now en route to a Croatian marina after it diverted toward Ireland. And finally, the other 2 ships, the Lion 1 and the Sea Viking, haven't declared a destination. All of those ships have got the message, and the message was made clear by Major General Buster Howes, who is a former Commandant General of the Royal Marines. Putin's propensity is to subvert the international order by 1,000 cuts. He takes an inch and grabs a mile. So I think he needs to be challenged wherever we can challenge him, Howes said in the wake of the Smyrtos raid. He added, "It's the right thing to do. We need to police our waters. We need to show that we have control over our waters." And that's the entire point. Putin thinks he can control other nations' waters by hiding his ships. The UK just wrested control right back from him, letting Putin know that the English Channel is now off limits. But the question has to be asked, why has it taken until June 14th, over 4 years after Russia invaded Ukraine, for the UK to finally carry out its first seizure of a Russian Shadow Fleet ship? There's a good reason, but before we dig into it, you're watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, now is the perfect time to hit that button. The UK has had a problem with the Shadow Fleet using the English Channel for a long time. In a May 12th report, BBC Verify identified 184 shady vessels, all of which have been sanctioned by the UK, that had combined to make 238 journeys through UK waters in the 7 weeks since Starmer delivered a March threat to Russia that he had granted the UK the power to intercept and board these vessels. Russia clearly didn't take the threat seriously, and up until mid-June it appeared to be right. Shadow Fleet ships were sailing through UK waters by the hundreds and they weren't being stopped. Then, something changed. The change had started with Starmer's warning. The UK's Prime Minister wasn't just blowing hot air. As Al Jazeera points out, Starmer had indeed given UK authorities the power to stop, board and detain sanctioned vessels in UK waters back in March. The legal framework was put in place, but it essentially sat unused for 11 weeks before Royal Marines stormed a Shadow Fleet ship on June 14th. Al Jazeera says that the framework alone wasn't enough. Other legal issues had to be sorted out, and the UK also had to work out how it was going to deal with the cost of storing seized vessels, which could very easily mount up if the country starts trying to tackle every Shadow Fleet ship that sails through its waters. So what the June 14th operation shows us is that the UK has worked out the kinks. We don't know how regular these types of seizures will be moving forward, but what we do know is that the UK has set a precedent that can no longer be denied. And that's very bad news for Russia. It means that the UK has finally made the jump from sanctioning to seizing. Here's what that means both for the future of the Shadow Fleet and Russia's war in Ukraine. What we've just seen is the UK adding the final piece to a puzzle that it's been trying to solve for 4 years. Before now, sanctions in their hundreds were the main tool that the UK had for stopping the Shadow Fleet. The Royal Navy's website points that out, noting that the UK has sanctions on more than 500 shady Russian vessels, and that those sanctions, along with those imposed by other Western powers, contributed to Russian oil and gas revenue declining by 24% in 2025. We saw a similar decline during the first quarter of 2026, as Russia's oil and gas revenue dropped by a further 45.4%. However, the increase in prices prompted by Operation Epic Fury had allowed Russia to start reversing the damage somewhat. Still, sanctions were doing about as well as they could. And the UK was far from inactive when it came to seizing Russian ships. It just wasn't doing so directly. For instance, the BBC reported on June 1st that France had seized a Shadow Fleet ship named the Tagor in Atlantic waters. Though France rightly took the credit for this capture, the UK has provided support by using a helicopter that was previously on board the HMS Somerset to track and monitor the Russian ship for France. Perhaps that was a learning experience for the UK. 2 weeks later, it conducted a seizure of its own. The UK followed up the June 14th capture of the Smyrtos with the June 16th announcement that it had introduced a new raft of sanctions against the Shadow. Over 20 vessels have been added to that list, showing Russia that the UK is now clamping down on its shady ships as hard as it can. More sanctions were added against shipping services and insurers that are supporting Russia's fleet, and the UK also became the first of the group of 7 nations to sanction ships that are part of Russia's Arctic Liquefied Natural Gas 2 project, which exports millions of tons of the gas as another source of what the UK government calls dirty revenue for Putin. What all of this means for the Shadow Fleet is the death of traversing UK waters safely from now on. The Royal Navy says that the Shadow Fleet is responsible for carrying 75% of Russia's sanctioned oil across a fleet of 700 vessels, which is a major lifeline for Putin and his war. The June 14th seizure is a timely shot delivered to Putin in several ways. There's the fact that it comes so soon after Healey's departure, which means we could interpret this as a message delivered by Starmer to the UK's people, letting them know that he does indeed take the Russian threat seriously. The move also came on the eve of a Group of 7 summit, during which the group discussed other measures they could take to support Ukraine. The UK can now look at what it did in the English Channel, as well as what it helped France to do a couple of weeks before, and say, look, this is how we help Ukraine now, put more pressure on the Shadow Fleet. And it's that pressure that is ultimately going to pay off. Why? The UK's seizure and the implication of more to come has happened at a time when Putin is finding it more difficult to fund his invasion than ever before. When we say that the Shadow Fleet is a vital part of Russia's current economic makeup, we're not being hyperbolic. According to The Guardian, the fleet generates an estimated $87 to $100 billion in annual revenue for Russia every year, all of which is money that can be taxed to ensure that billions continue to flow into Putin's war chest. It could be argued that the Shadow Fleet is the primary revenue artery that is keeping Russia alive right now. So the fact that the UK has started conducting raids on Shadow Fleet ships couldn't have come at a worse time for Russia. The country is already on the brink of a devastating recession as a result of Putin's wartime spending and policies. Jacobin reports that Russia's federal budget deficit reached around 2.5% of the country's entire gross domestic product, or GDP, during the first 4 months of 2026. And it's now already higher during those 4 months than the entire 2025 deficit. Russia recorded its first decline in its GDP during the first quarter of 2026 in 3 years, and yet Putin keeps spending money on his war. Euromaidan Press reports that 46% of the Russian budget went toward the war in early 2026, even as revenue was falling. And now Shadow Fleet ships are being seized. An already overstretched Russia is now on the fast track to financial hell, especially if these seizures become a common occurrence. On the battlefield, the money drying up will wreak havoc on Putin's plans for Ukraine. Russia is already at the point where it's offering record-breaking $80,000 signing bonuses to soldiers, along with 6-figure debt relief and massive wages. That hasn't stopped Russian recruitment from being 20% lower during the first quarter of 2026 than it was during the same period in 2025, CNN reports. Russia's entire war effort relies on being able to spend enormous amounts of money to tempt volunteers into signing up. That approach can't be sustained if revenue from the Shadow Fleet dries up. Even short-term hits like the one that the UK just inflicted are damaging. They create risk, which leads to delays as ships either don't sail or find alternative routes, all of which affect the Russian military's cash flow. Russia's military recruitment costs alone now account for an estimated 9.5% of the country's federal budget, and it's becoming clearer that the Kremlin needs to offer more than even the record-breaking sums it's offering right now to counteract a burgeoning recruitment crisis. So what the UK did isn't just strike against the Shadow Fleet. It's a dagger plunged into the beating heart of the Russian war machine. Russia's plan of spending its way to a win is being threatened by a combination of sanctions and seizures, and the UK has officially thrown its hat into the latter game after spending years spearheading the former. Could more be done to stop Russia's shady fleet? Sure. In a June 4th piece, United 24 Media argued that most captured Shadow Fleet ships are detained, inspected, and eventually released due to a lack of European legislation that enables permanent capture. That could be the next step, creating new legislation that takes Russia's captured ships off the water permanently. Then, actions that worry Putin today could turn into a campaign that cripples Russia's war tomorrow. But for now, Royal Marines storming a Shadow Fleet ship sends a strong message. The UK is coming for Russia's shady ships, and the waters around the UK are a lot less safe than they were before. France has already been delivering that message to Russia. We mentioned the capture of the Targor in this video, and you can learn more about what France did, how the UK helped, and what this capture means. How? By watching our video, where we deep dive into how France has signaled a new phase in how the West deals with the Shadow Fleet. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show to see more of our analysis of the latest actions taken by Western powers to hurt Putin and his war machine. And thank you as always for watching.